So let's press on with our discussion of globalization and the whole process of developing globalization, of course, which implies discussing its opposite, deglobalization. So we're following Frieden on this, and it's turning into a discussion of globalization in terms of the whole history of capitalism. So I'm perfectly happy with that. And as you know, I consider this Frieden a tremendously valuable book, very lucid and very interesting, even though we may not agree with him on every point. In fact, quite a few points we may disagree with him. Nevertheless, a splendid textbook. And we're following him along, and he's treating it as a history of capitalism. So we have a rise and fall, a whole large picture of what's happened in capitalism ever since the era of Napoleon. And so I find this tremendously interesting, and we're continuing in that vein. We've reached the point now where we're discussing a process of deglobalization. So he's introduced this notion of a globalization Mark I, and that is the same thing as Neil Ferguson's idea of Anglo-globalization, same thing. The British Empire in the 19th century, British imperialism as the foreshadowing of the era of globalization, with all of the things that implies, and we've already been talking about that a great deal. So we've reached the point now where that's in decline. We're in 1914. You know that the interpretation of Frieden is that capitalism in the 19th century falls apart. Collapses in World War I. And when he talks about capitalism, he is talking about it, of course, on an international scale, free trade, the gold standard, and everything that goes with that. So we're into the discussion of deglobalization. Globalization introduces the subject of deglobalization. And that's a historical way of putting the question, in my opinion, a lot better than many of the books you'll pick up about globalization, which don't treat it in terms of history, or at any rate, just treat it in terms of precursors in the broadest sense, evidences of trade in the past, all leading, of course, to this perfect system of globalization. But Frieden doesn't follow that road, and he follows it through its ups and downs, and that's what interests us, and we're there as historians in order to follow this story. You're also reading Kuznick and Stone about the United States in the 30s. So that will help us on a number of points, give us interesting background, not a very complete background in my opinion. And as you already know, I've written on this topic at great length, and my book, The Rise of Global Powers, has a good deal more, a lot more detail than Stone and Kuznick have on the world politics of the period. And I've got to say a lot more detail than Frieden has on the topic. So those of you who are so fascinated with the things I've said in this class and want to go further, press even further, I recommend to you that you look at The Rise of Global Powers. You'll see everything I think about the topic. I'm a lot more long-winded than both of these authorities we're using for this course. So get prepared for a very detailed excursion into the topic if you do go to that volume. Okay, so today let's discuss the Great Deglobalization, a period that runs according to the outline that I've sent you to accompany this discussion. It runs from 1914 to 1968. The outline has a number of topics, and practically every paragraph in the outline there could be a whole book or more on this topic. So we are condensing ruthlessly in order to take an overview and see this thing in terms of 1 hour's worth of discussion, 1 hour's lecture on this topic. So it's a tough go. And as a matter of fact, I can't even deal adequately, and even in the sketchy way I'll have to do, I can't even deal adequately with everything on this outline in the next hour. I'll have to content myself with taking up maybe the first half of the outline, and then we'll devote another lecture to the second half of the outline. First half takes us up to World War II. Second half takes us through the Cold War. So those are gigantic chunks of history to sum up in 1 hour, but for our purposes, it's necessary to do this. I think it's necessary for us to take a big look at this and paint with the broad brush, so to speak. All right, so there we are in World War I. According to Frieden, that's the beginning of the deglobalization period, or at any rate, that's the end of the first period of globalization. It happens on account of the war. There's no equivocation in Frieden's conception of that, and I buy that, by the way, as I've indicated to you in the past. I like that interpretation. I don't see economic causes in the destruction of the Anglobalization, so to speak. I see political ones, but not economic causes. So there we are in the middle of World War I. So what does that tell us? For the most part, I think it tells us that Britain was not a real hegemon the way it really wanted to be, or not a real hegemon in the sense that the model of Anglobalization seems to suggest. In other words, economic history is kidding us about this and singling out the economic aspects of the world financial system, the world economy, free trade, global gold standard, things of that sort, singling those things out and making it out that the whole world revolved around those ideas in order to write economic history. It's an illusion, I think, to look at history that way. And I think the British, maybe they began to realize how illusory it was to imagine that their economy was built, for example, on trade. You know, A.J.P. Taylor, in his famous volume in the 1980s, writing about Germany back in the 1880s. Germany's first bid for colonies was the title of Taylor's book. And he said in there, how did the British get their empire? He said they got it by trade. They got it by trade. Wow. I don't think that idea holds up very well to the in the eyes of an historian of the British Empire, that they got it by trade. But let's not press that matter just now. I think the realization started to sink in that this World War has come at the end of a tremendous period of imperial ambition on the part of all the leading powers, but really Britain at their forefront. So if you can say that all the powers are reaching all over the globe, as this cartoon seems to indicate, trying to grab something on every continent, that would be perfectly accurate. Of course, this would be the way someone in Africa or in Asia, imagine an intellectual in Asia first starting to read about history, the history we're talking about. It's the way an intellectual in Asia would look at these things. He'd see the Europeans out with their little grab bag, reaching out to see what they can grab all over the globe. So we can't say that, I suppose. I'm generalizing it from the standpoint of, say, a world historian. But we have to say that the British really are at the forefront of all of this. And indeed, that is the precise connection we're trying to make to this Anglobalization model, according to which their economy is developing on a worldwide scale. And it's on account of the hegemony, really, of the British Navy and of British imperialism. And you see it fighting all over the globe. They're penetrating all over Africa, and they're fighting the Boer War, arms in hand, with thousands of troops against the Boers. They're active in the Far East and all the rest. We talked about that last time. Well, the British experience in World War I is finally convincing them in the sharpest possible way that they really didn't have hegemony over the world sufficient to be able to put down a rival, in this case, Germany. They didn't have that sort of hegemony over the world. So what did they have? They had an excellent position as a naval power, a power which did not have to raise troops in order to have an impact on international politics, but ultimately a power that depended on its alliances, that it depended on others to maintain a balance of power. So in the 19th century, we already said the British were thinking about depending on the Germans to maintain a balance of power against France and Russia. And on other occasions, depending on either France or Russia for something else. They're always depending on another power. That's the conception of the balance of power. You're not a real hegemon. You need others to maintain your position as, well, how to put it, first among equals, perhaps, in the international scheme of reckoning. Well, the one who's come out first in World War I is the United States. So the British are now in a position where they've spent so much on the war and they've got so much in debt to the United States that they really are not the center of world politics anymore. And it's frequently said on both sides of the Atlantic at the end of World War I that Britain is no longer the financial center of the world as she was during the days of the Globalization, so to speak, in the 19th century. But the United States is now in that position, the world's leading creditor, whereas the United States was a debtor prior to World War I. Now the world's leading creditor. And moreover, there's another enormous new impact that never gets proper attention among the economic historians, and that is the Russian Revolution. So World War I ended, with this massive world epidemic of influenza, but it also ended with this gigantic mutiny on the Eastern Front, where the Russians left the war. And not only did they leave the war, but in order to get out of the war, they gave power to the Bolsheviks, who were Marxists and communists, and international-minded Marxists and communists, much more so than the Marxists of the prior period. And when they got power in Russia, the Bolsheviks not only said that Russia was going to hold out against everybody else, well, of course, they were immediately forced to do this. They wanted to play ball with everybody. This is the old story. We can follow it down to the details, down to Venezuela in our day, where power wants to go its own way, wants to have its own kind of social system, but other powers interfere from without, and one has to resist with all of the forces of national energy, so to speak, dictatorship, really, over all of the social forces that it can gather in its defense to defend its path against outsiders. They're in the position of the Russians, and so they have this massive intervention by all the powers at the end of the war, all of the imperial powers, of course. And not only do they want it at first to get Russia back in the war, they intervened in 1918, and got the United States to go along with it. Well, the United States had no real interest in the matter and was quite reluctant and ineffectual about the whole thing. Nevertheless, the United States went along with the thing, and they intervened in Russia. So Russia was fighting, as the Russian propaganda put it, some 14 nations in the Allied intervention right after World War I. It runs from 1918 to 1921. Finally, she fought that off with her inner resources, the bitterest kind of dictatorship, to fight that off. And it finally succeeded in doing it. So Russia becomes the most revolutionary regime ever seen in history up to this time. Well, there have been revolutions, but nothing like this. A socialist revolution, which is international minded, anti-imperialist, which argues that the getting out of the war means a revolution against imperialism all over the whole world. Marxists didn't say this prior to World War I, but now the Bolsheviks do. That it means a revolution against all of the imperial powers. So really, it's a revolution against the whole 19th century, against all of imperialism. There's a little map, a little propaganda poster of the Russian Revolution as a great, great herald unto the whole world, unto the workers of the whole world. You see the crowd that this Bolshevik is addressing in that poster there. Yes, they represent peoples from all over the entire world. It's all of the colonial world. So not only is the Bolshevik revolution a clarion call to repeat the revolution in every country that participated in the war, as the first thing the Bolsheviks wanted. Remember, they're Marxists. They're thinking about the most advanced countries. The most advanced countries. So that's the first call. But the second call, as you see from the shadings of red, it's kind of interesting the way they did this. The shadings of red on the map give a rough indication, very rough in fact, but a rough indication of the places they're thinking about. They're thinking about West Europe, they're thinking about maybe Egypt, the area around Suez. In fact, all the coasts of Africa. So it's really a negation of the British Empire that they pretty much have in mind. They're very much thinking about China, that China may repeat, along with the Europeans. Not to say that they thought a potential Chinese revolution was more important than a European one. No, they wanted that revolution in Germany. That was going to be the world revolution as far as they were concerned. And of course, it's pretty close to that. We can see that as historians, that if Germany and Russia had gone down the same road in 1918, 19, or maybe again in 1923, or some might argue even again just prior to Hitler coming to power in 1932, if those two had conjoined in communist revolution and made common cause, it'd be very difficult for anybody in the world to quarrel with them. I mean, it'd be possible to make war against Russia and Germany. So that's the first desideratum of the Russian Revolution. Even more than building socialism in Russia, as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned, was to make a revolution in Germany. That would be the world revolution. And they're very much globally minded. So this is how to put it, in the era of globalism, if we're talking about globalism, we really should pay a certain amount of attention to this idea that's introduced, that the communists are also trying to globalize the whole world with revolution. You never see that mentioned. You never see that taken up. The revolution that went on in Russia is regarded as more or less a footnote. But it was not a footnote to the people of that era, to the people outside of Russia. And I think we have to say, as world historians, that between World War I and World War II, the number one thing on the mind of all the countries in the world, the United States, a very progressive country and a democratic country, Nazi Germany turning out to be a very fascist country, just the opposite, England, liberal England, on all of the minds of all of the notables in all those very different countries. The first thing on their mind was that they did not want to see this Russian Revolution spread. They wanted to see this thing stopped. And of course, Hitler's great offer to them is that he was going to be the one, Germany, a fascist Germany, was going to be the one to stop it. That's very, very tempting for all of the notables in all of the societies of the outside world. This is a general reflection that I think is worth making. I'm not going to say much about this as we proceed, but I think it's a general reflection that's worth making at this juncture in the discussion. The Russian Revolution is a world revolt against imperialism, much more so than the Marxist family out of which Russian Bolshevism sprung, because in the 19th century, Marxists, and this is an interesting thing about Marxism did not have a thoroughgoing idea of a world that was revolting against imperialism. I think they imagined that Germany would probably be the country of the future. They couldn't imagine a general war, although they feared it like anybody else. Germany as the leading Marxist country, a German-Russian, well, I don't know. Maybe the Germans could have had some influence on Russia, but at any rate, a social democratic Germany, would have been able to operate on its own and lead a very progressive world. I think you could say that the attitude that Marxists in the German Social Democratic Party had prior to World War I, and this also would count for Friedrich Engels himself, I think you could say that the attitude those gentlemen would have had about the future of a socialist Germany is kind of comparable to Xi Jinping and the Chinese communists today. Imagining that they have power. Well, Germans didn't get the power, but the Chinese have the power. And they would have a very sophisticated economy, maybe the most sophisticated economy in the world. They'd be nice as pie to other people. And use all sorts of subtle measures to dominate them in the future, because their idea was going to be the one that solved all the economic and other problems in the world. If only there wasn't a big war to ruin everything, that under those conditions, they would come out dominant and would run the world. Socialism in the 19th century would run the world. Now Lenin is thinking communism is running the world. But the big difference was that the socialists in the 19th century didn't conceive of a revolt of places like India and China against imperialism. Couldn't conceive of it. Not within the framework of 19th century Marxism. Certainly within the framework, though, of Bolshevik Marxism, once the Russians had made a revolution. So I stress this point. I'm not going to come back to it very much, but I think it's worth considering at this point. Let's consider the relationship between the powers that won the war. That's more interesting, more immediately interesting for us in terms of what Frieden is talking about. Frieden misses entirely, or is not interested at all in pursuing this question of Soviet Russia. And Kuznick and Stone, they do pursue it somewhat, but maybe not adequately. And let's talk about the relations that they're interested in, and especially the ones between England and the United States, between Britain and the United States. So here's an interesting graph for us. It has, let's see if I can get my pointer working here. There it is. So here you see the leading powers. By the end of the war, they are the UK and the United States. So Britain and the United States leading at the top. And this has been a process of the others sinking into oblivion, as you can see. Or at any rate, the others falling into a position of eclipse by the Anglo-Saxons. That's the way they would have put it. Certainly the French would have put it exactly like that. They would have said the Anglo-Saxons when they talked about Britain and the United States. General de Gaulle will talk in exactly the same way in the 1960s, and the French often talk that way even today. The United States has come to the position where it is its economy is growing very considerably, really at the expense, almost at the expense of the British economy. It was practically the leading economy in the world. And during the war, the United States has been the principal supplier to the British. So the first part of the war, the United States didn't want to have anything to do with it. And there was an influence of populism and progressivism to suggest that they shouldn't have anything to do, should not get involved in the slightest way in Europe, should not lend any money, for example, to any of the belligerents in Europe. That went by the board fairly quickly. In 1915, the United States started making loans to the British. Why? Because the United States industry exploded and, in effect, enjoyed such a period of rapid growth, transforming the United States, and certainly in relative scales of balance between industrial powers. Transforming the United States is absolutely number one, with no equivocation to it. We've seen from other graphs that the United States is already getting to that position, leading industrial producer, at least by about 1905 or so, leading industrial producer in the world. But now this has caused an even much more fabulous explosion of growth in the United States. Not only supplying industrial products, but arms themselves, rifles and things like that, and agricultural products as well. Really, the whole economy of the world gets completely thrown into a cocked hat in the course of the World War lasting 4 years, so that the United States picks up all of the pieces. Frieden, very good in describing how this works out, the essential facts of the matter. But at any rate, the United States started to lend a lot of money to the British, and, well, the question arose, what would happen if the British lost? And so the money eventually was followed by troops. And this became a huge thesis developed by the Nye Committee in 1934-5, which you'll read about in Stone and Kuznick. The so-called Merchants of War, Merchants of Debt thesis, and all the rest of that, which says that the United States lent money to the British when they couldn't pay anymore for the stuff that the United States was selling on the British, and that eventually, when the idea arose that the British might lose, that the United States had to make sure that didn't happen. And so there's your analysis of the entry of the United States into World War I. I don't want to take this thing up in detail now for its own sake, but bear in mind that this is a kind of a powerful, intuitive thought that was thought and that was reinforced enormously, as Stone and Kuznick demonstrate, reinforced enormously by the Nye Committee in the 1930s, to the point where all of the educated public opinion in the United States pretty much endorsed this idea. It had a very bad effect, of course. It made the United States very pacifist in the era of the rise of the fascist powers, when we might take the view, I take the view, that pacifism in the era of European fascism would have been a very bad course for the United States. It's a dramatic, shocking fact that it's very hard. You have to understand what this generation was up against, trying to grapple with this difficult fact that they had to make war again against fascism. It's a very tough thing. At any rate, that's the relationship between Britain and the United States. And then after the war, in victory, it affects all the other relationships. It affects reparations. I don't think to the degree that the British and the French made it out, and especially the British. So here we're coming up against the British way of looking at history, which has such an influence over us because the British are so clever and so brilliant at writing history and writing anything, by comparison with the provincials in the United States, that we always feel somehow beholden to them intellectually, especially with regard to the interpretation of history. They write a lot more history and often a lot better history than we in the United States. So there's this problem we have, not so much with Eurocentrism as with what I would call Anglocentrism in our interpretations. Often, though, however, our books about the international relations of the 20s, they pretty much take the British point of view. And I think I would accuse Frieden of this. He gives us a British picture of the economy of the thing. Well, let me describe this model of the British interpretation of the post-war economy. So it centers on the whole problem of reparations. We know the Germans just hate this reparations burden they're stuck with at the end of the war. John Maynard Keynes made his reputation in his marvelously written, brilliant tract of 1919, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and it pretty much says, gee, what a ridiculous thing to punish Germany at the end of the war. Germany is the center of all the wealth in Europe. That's a pre-war British position. Very pro-German, and certainly not warlike toward Germany. No profit at all in war with Germany, but of course, there it came. They had it. But that's the position that Keynes takes, pretty much the pre-war position. And what to do about it? Well, just the opposite of what we're doing now, punishing the Germans with a big reparations bill. We should do everything, just the opposite, everything to build up Germany and make her more powerful. Put Russia under her wing, Keynes says in this document of 1919. Put Russia under Germany's wing. So just the opposite. And of course, just the opposite of what the French presumably would like. And of course, this is not just a presumption. This is the point. The French have to have these reparations, want these reparations. They want the money. The war was fought in France. They consider it just. So we could too. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the British, to the French statement of the point of view, except one has to recognize it for what it is. It looks at reparations not just in terms of the benefits reparations will provide to the French economically, which that doesn't need explaining too much, but in terms of the idea that it's going to keep Germany down. No, it's not just an economic argument, it's a political argument for keeping Germany weak. There's a good cartoon expressing this point. You know, there's the peace treaty and Wilson's 14 points, and here's one more point, the point of a sword stuck into the belly of the German by the Frenchman. And that is, I think that's the point of reparations. Maybe even more of a point, I would say, and although one could have argument about this, but maybe even more of a point than the economic benefits of reparations. It's the idea of keeping the Germans down. And Raymond Poincaré, who is worth consideration, although we can't pay much attention to him in this course. He's a premier of great importance to the French in the 1920s. I'll talk a little bit more about his economic policies. He said, it would pain me. It would pain me if the Germans were to pay. So he wanted to keep them down. He wanted the reparations to be high enough that the Germans just couldn't possibly pay them, or could just barely pay them. And but he was thwarted at every turn, at least as much as possible, by the British. The British did not take this view at all. The British wanted to see Germany, as you see from the Keynes discussion in 1919, they want to see Germany recover. They have the opposite conception of the French, and they oppose the French in imperial matters too, in the Far East, in the Middle East. Well, perhaps not so much in the Far East as in the Middle East, but definitely in the Middle East in a big way. We can't go into that here. And they oppose the French even on the continent, think they're militarists and don't want to get back to peaceful economic relations. Well, there's something to this argument, because peaceful economic relations would bring Germany back, maybe too fast. Maybe Germany would eclipse France, maybe too dramatically. I think this is kind of in the cards anyhow, but there's a political point of view to this economic discussion, in other words, and a political antagonism, not just an economic one, between Britain and France. Whose point of view does the United States take in this? Generally, I have to say the British, largely because of Anglocentrism, but also because there's a bit of a tendency to see the United States having more of an interest in Germany than in France. It comes from the Joseph Chamberlain era, I guess, where Chamberlain kicked around among all the many things his fertile imagination could concoct, some kind of alliance between all the Anglo-Saxons, meaning the United States, Britain, and Germany, in one kind of rendering of the idea. Not to say he pressed this idea on all occasions, but he did raise the question, and there is a kind of a sort of a sense of all the countries, all their notables are thinking in terms of their national interests and asking themselves this difficult question, what are our national interests vis-a-vis a lot of different countries? It's not so easy to answer even today. What are our national interests? What's good for the United States vis-a-vis all these different countries in the world today? And again, I say it's a little bit more toward the Anglo-centric point of view than toward what you might call the Franco-centric. In fact, that word sounds strange, doesn't it? Franco-centric. Yeah, we don't think that way. But Anglo-centric doesn't sound as strange to me. Well, and what's the American point of view? Is there an American point of view that's different from the British? Yes, of course. And I'll expand on that in a minute. There's a cartoon from Punch that sort of expresses the point I'm trying to make, that after the war, the British, of course, have won together with the France, and here's John Bull together with his French consort. And but he's looking back at these Germans, and he's thinking, maybe I should not be so hostile and antagonistic just for the sake of France toward Germany. Naturally, the French don't like that idea at all. They like to see the maximum antagonism toward Germany. A person like Poincaré definitely would put it that way. So the French are trying to exact these reparations. And then there's the argument that they have to exact these reparations because there are massive war debts to the United States that still have to be paid. The United States should take the view of writing off these war debts. That's an Anglo-centric point of view. That's Frieden's point of view. That was taught to me too. I don't buy it at all, but that was taught. I'm definitely in the minority on this topic. Most of my teachers and most of the stuff I've read, but of course mostly written by British or Germans, but most of what they argue is the United States really did not pursue a very smart economic policy. Number one, it should have given the British and the French a break on their war debts. They in turn could have given the Germans a break on reparations. Germany would have recovered. We would have a peaceful system. Blah 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 blah. That's the argument, and it has another door to it, and that's the tariff door. How could we ask people to repay their war debts to the United States? So the argument runs, while the United States closes off its world market to their exports. So the United States should take down the tariff barriers and start consuming British goods, French goods, other goods to a much greater degree, and allow them to earn the money to pay their war debts. And so that we had a particularly niggardly, that's an unfortunate word they would have used, attitude, short-sighted, unintelligent attitude toward these things did the United States in its isolationism. So to speak. This is the model. This is the argument. I don't buy this at all. I don't buy this at all. This is the way the English, of course, the way Keynes looked at it. But I don't think this is right. Look at this from the standpoint of the United States after the war. Now, in order to say this, I have to say, when I say the United States, I am talking primarily, I have to admit, to the richest, most powerful people in the United States, to American finance, American heavy industry, and all the rest of that. Northern rather than Southern. Tobacco exporters in the South, cotton exporters in the South would look at it differently, would want to be on better terms with the British, would take a much more Anglo-centric, so to speak, line on this. But in the North, one can envision an actual American national. You consider it short-sighted, if you like, but at any rate, it's an American national viewpoint on this matter. And the viewpoint is more or less, why on earth should we give everybody a break on the money that they borrowed? They borrowed all this money from us. If we give them a break on it, that means they're asking us to pick up the tab for World War I. We didn't want World War I. We Americans hardly even understood it in the beginning. Question of Serbian independence? The threat to Serbia? Balkan matter? The United States is not interested in these things. They borrowed the money, didn't they? This is exactly what Calvin Coolidge said. It's always quoted to make out how short-sighted everybody is in the United States. But that is the idea. Really, what the British are saying to the United States is, why don't you pay for World War I? You know, it's a war that's fought mainly for our interest, to reduce Germany. It's not an interest of the United States. Why did you pay for it? And then there's the other argument, the export argument. Why don't you open up your doors, the British might say to the United States? Why don't you open up your doors and allow all the exports in? You know, it's short-sighted of you not to allow us to pay our debts with exports. Okay, so if the United States takes down all its tariff barriers, that means its industries won't be predicted, and a lot of this industrial expansion that we've been talking about won't be supported by tariff protection anymore, and our industries will have to pay their own way in the sense that they'll have to compete with all the other industries in the world. Why don't we take the car industry, for example? The United States, very, very sophisticated and way ahead of the game with regard to the cars, but the British are not fools, and the Europeans are not fools. They can make cars, as they demonstrated after World War II. Suppose instead of Ford and the other American automakers getting so important in the 20s and 30s, they'd had to share their market, maybe a big hunk of their market. Maybe the autos of foreigners would have undersold American cars, would have been more attractive and more better made, and that's more or less what happened in the 1960s and 50s and 60s. That's more or less happened when the European auto imports made their invasion into the United States. Well, that would have happened in the 20s and 30s. So, you know, that would have caused some unemployment in the northern cities. There would have been a price to pay. The United States would have set up its heavy industry. You can look at this in various ways. The heavy industry in terms of the big industrial giants, but also its workers, its industrial workers. Would have set them up for a rather hard ride. Maybe the United States would have come to prefer some of these imported cars and start investing in their production in their countries rather than in the United States. And the people who would have to pay the price would be the American industrial workers. Okay, so this gives you the general outlines of an American reflexive, I have to admit, reflexive national position here, as opposed to what you might call the Anglo-centric argument that dominates most of the literature, and Frieden too. Frieden follows it. It dominates most of the literature. And then there, of course, there's another prong to it. How about the League of Nations? The United States didn't join the League of Nations. Oh, how short-sighted. Oh, how isolationist. Blah, 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 blah. All right, once again, let's look at it from the standpoint of the American notables and their conception of their national interests vis-a-vis the other powers. We join some kind of organization like that that has a collective security idea rather than a balance of power idea, rather than a national interest idea of dealing with world problems and world balances. It means that any country we have relations with, that the country might want to, I don't know, make a protest against us or steal a march on us or whatever, can take it to the United Nations and have it voted on by all the countries in the world. In other words, the United States gets its way. Forgive me for being so cynical about this, but the United States gets its way in Latin America, for example, during this period. And it's really going to get its way after the war. With Britain in terrible shape, the British won't dominate the Argentine market to the same extent that the United States will. Frieden is good on this. But if any kind of squawk emerges with some small country in Latin America, they can immediately take it to the League of Nations and get the League of Nations to, to make a judgment against the United States. Is that in the United States' interest? From the standpoint, once again, we have to say, of the big economic interests involved in this thing. You can see why they would think, no. It does not take much imagination to see why they would say, no, we don't want that. If there is some big thing to be taken care of with this so-called collective security idea, that means raising armies all over the place. Where are these armies to be found? Probably in the United States, they might answer. So every squawk that goes on everywhere in the world is going to have to be met by an international force. Presumably the United States will have to carry the ball. Well, at least as it regards naval matters, because the United States Navy is now getting to the point where it's right in the same league with the British. We cannot go into this in the way that it deserves, but that's one of the problems. One of the problems we have to consider here. So there are lots of reasons why the United States might take a different view of this than was taken by Keynes, for example. But this is the way you see it in the literature. Keynes wins the day on all of this stuff. Well, we got to the point of talking about the French and the Germans. The Germans are trying to figure out ways not to make their payments. They're very onerous. They're very convenient for the Germans because they can blame anything that goes wrong in Germany on the French now. And they say it's all reparations. Very dishonest on their part, but that is the tendency of the period. And the French wondering about these payments. Finally, at the point, at the end of 1922, the French decided that there was a certain inflation of the German currency. Let's see if we can see it on this map. Where is this inflation? Well, you can see it already. It's inflated 4 times during World War I. Then afterward, there's a bit of an inflation in the currency, or I should say a devaluation. Inflation isn't the right word there. Inflation means against value against goods. Devaluation means against currencies. So there's a certain devaluation of the currency going on right away. And then we can see it crawling along. And the French are starting to get kind of fed up with it. And at a certain point, they say, well, we don't want the German marks as currency anymore. We don't want you to pay your debts in marks because they're getting constantly devalued. They're worth less and less. So from now on, we want gage productif, they say, productive guarantees. Well, they have to send timber and, all sorts of products out of the factories on rail cars instead of money to the French. And that's when the inflation really takes off with these gage productif at the end of 1922, especially when Raymond Poincaré, came back to power. Then you see the inflation is not just an inflation. You could say it's an inflation at this time, but from this point on, it's this hyperinflation. This is a word that hasn't even been used in the past, but hyperinflation, meaning they're absolutely going to destroy the currency entirely. It's going to be worthless. On the way, well, you can see it's already in 1923. It's well on the way to being completely worthless, and it is going to get to be, shortly thereafter, going to be completely worthless. So they're going to kill their currency. This is the most rabid nationalist response that the Germans can make, short of war, got to say. And what was the attitude taken toward this by the British? The French took the view that the British didn't mind it at all, and in fact sided with the Germans. That's the French. So, reading Keynes, you could sort of see how the French would argue that. And in fact, the French go so far as to say that the British speculated on the Amsterdam Exchange against the mark, and engineered this whole thing, or at any rate helped engineer it. The French say and they still say these things today. The French historians tell a very different story about these things than the British historians. What's our view on the matter? Should we just say the French are wrong because they're French? Would that be Anglo-centric on our part? Or should we consider both sides? Let's try that, considering both sides. And seeing where they come from in terms of their national interests. That's useful to us, I think, as economic historians. At any rate, Germany almost went under. Hitler made an attempt to get power. It looked as if Germany was going to break up. There was an enormous panic in the United States over these events of the French occupation and the hyperinflation in 1922-23. And finally, with the destruction of the German currency, the United States felt it had to step in. And it did step in with the Dawes Plan, concocted in the United States. And the Dawes Plan set up an arrangement whereby the Germans would still be required to make reparations payments to the British and the French. British and French would still, it's assumed, be required to make war debts payments to the United States. But the United States would end up lending all sorts of money to Germany. Now, I have presented this in its terms of the most brutal simplification, and I think vastly more nuanced and complex than this, of course, but that, I think, is the general picture. Looking at it from the standpoint of the French, certainly you can see where that's the general picture. That may seem quite irrational for the world to depend on a system of payments like this. You remember the triangular trade idea from the 18th century, when we were talking about that. This is another kind of triangular economic relationship. This is on which the whole world economy basically was being reconstructed, hopefully on the basis of a gold standard, because we want these payments to be worth something. So the United States has an interest in getting everybody onto gold and being very insistent about that. The United States, of course, accrues the blame if one wants to assign blame for going on the gold standard. The United States must assume an element of blame there, if you will, but it wants to be paid in good coin. There it is. And the British go back on gold on a par that is comparable to what they paid prior to the war. Brutal. That's brutal. In order to pay that, they have to bring prices down dramatically. They have to have deflation, terrible deflation, enormous unemployment, and of course they're going to get resistance. Wages are sticky, says Keynes. They're going to get resistance from the miners, end up with a huge miners' strike, turns into a general strike, and a general crisis of the whole system. Bolsheviks are thinking maybe there's an opportunity in Britain, of all places, for a socialist revolution in 1926. So all those things are inherent in this notion of this circular balance. This circular system of payments on which the world was trying to be built. Well, at any rate, it has to be built on the basis of a gold standard. How are the Germans going to interpret this? Well, there's a lot of very poisonous nationalist literature on this that has a great case to be made. Of course. But it's only a great case if you consider that Germans have been defeated. Excuse me, that the Germans have not been defeated in war. This would be if the Germans are really defeated, these impositions would be sort of ABC. Germans didn't really think they lost the war, so they thought they thought they were getting a negotiated settlement according to the 14 points of Wilson. This is what they got. They got Versailles. Versailles is a broken leg for them. And they get the Dawes Plan in 1924. That's another imposition. It's a scar on their forearm there. Then they get the Young Plan. That's another plan. In 1929, Hitler said our movement really benefited from the Young Plan because such hatred among the Germans developed, on account of their financial exploiters. So there, and who's the doctor? A strange-looking fellow in this cartoon. He's got a big nose. This is the Sturmer Jew of anti-Semitic propaganda in Germany. It's going to appear in all sorts of cartoon versions, and always look at it, much different from the German nose, as you can see. Always to blame for anything that goes wrong economically. It's the Jewish financiers. Now, if they say financiers, they have a bit of an argument. If they say Jewish financiers, are we going to say that the non-Jewish financiers had a different line than the others? As you can see, it has the benefits of not being a very scientific kind of economic argument, but it's an argument in politics and in history. Nevertheless, the anti-Semitic kind of interpretation of the impositions of international finance. Here's another way of putting it. And there you see the Dawes Plan has tied up the German worker, the German citizen, and he's tied up like a beast of burden, and he's got a bit in his mouth, and beating him and driving him on. A little fellow that looks like he might be another Sturmer Jew. The Sturmer was a propaganda organ of the Nazis in the 30s that specialized in anti-Semitic cartooning. So there's the argument, and often it is associated with the figure of Gottfried Feder, F-E-D-E-R, interesting fellow, a writer on economic affairs, a very original writer on economic affairs. You might say he was the first economist in which Hitler put faith when his movement was getting started. And you might even say, perhaps more strongly than that probably Feder had more intellectual influence over the economic thinking of Hitler, such as it was, right up to the time when he took power. But of course, once he took power, he had to push Feder aside. What did Feder say? Feder said something similar. It's not out of this world. Something similar to what Henry George said, that the main problem is not between the worker and the capitalist, as Karl Marx might say. The main problem is between all of them and the financier and the bank. It's interest slavery. Some people say this is an anti-Semitic argument. That is using anti-Semitism as kind of, how to put it, a kind of shield for international banking. Feder's work was not so wildly anti-Semitic as I thought when I first heard his ideas summarized. When I actually read his work, I noted that it wasn't particularly obsessive about the role of the Jews or anything like that, about its anti-Semitism, but it was just this steamy case against international finance, blaming international finance for all of the agonies to which the Germans were subject. And really not, in a lot of ways, not so much different from the writings in this sense of C.H. Douglas in Britain, the famous social credit idea. He makes a very similar argument that all of the small business and the working class, farmer, they all have an interest in a government scheme of providing social credit, and mainly suppression of the banks. That interest slavery is the thing that has to be overcome. Not so much capitalism as such, but interest slavery. And this is a kind of like Henry George's argument. There'd be quite a few people who'll be making this argument. Here we've picked actually three different people in three completely different economic and political contexts who have these similar anti-banking, anti-finance ideas in their hearts. So you can see that it's compatible with a lot of different political perspectives. Just a very generalized economic argument, very much in the air in the 20s and 30s, and I would argue it's even very much in the air today. The French are thinking in terms, though, of their traditional perspectives, the perspectives of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, C-O-L-B-E-R-T, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, a minister in the government of Louis XIV back in the 17th century, organizer of canals and public works on a vast scale, mercantilist conceptions of the economy, tariff barriers, import quotas, things of that sort, public works, whatever's good for the economy, the national economy. That's where Colbert began, and not with any kind of conception of natural law or, any kind of free trade or some kind of larger global. He's the anti-globalist par excellence. You might say he's still the figure who personifies the tradition of national economy for the French, even today, the way Alexander Hamilton might in the United States. Colbert. So Colbert and Colbertism, those are the things that I think moved the French in these days, and the French pursued a very nationalist policy. We can't go into this in the detail that it deserves, but it revolves around setting the interest rates and pegging their currencies in such a way as to create a surplus and build up a what one economist called a fighting fund of foreign exchange. So nowadays we compare them to the countries that have sovereign wealth funds, which they husband from their management, you have to say, their management of foreign trade and foreign economic relations in general, the pegging of their currencies and things of that sort. So Colbertism is very, very much with us today. You might say that the revolt that's going on against globalism today, maybe Frieden would say this, is a kind of a national version of Colbertism in all the different countries of the world. You might say that. At any rate, there's the effect of the thing in France. The French are going to have a policy through the Depression where things are going reasonably well for them from the ratio of gold at any rate. And that's what everybody thinks of most. We're all trying to go back in the gold standard after the United States exhorting about it in 1925 and 6. And the French are doing rather well, as you can see in this thing, and the United States rather less well, and the British not so great either, So the French are really, actually, they're picking up more gold through this whole period, and the Americans and the Anglo-Saxons in general are losing gold to the French. We got a better. Here's the more famous diagram. This shows it very dramatically. There's the United States losing gold. And United Kingdom, British, they're losing gold, not as dramatically as the United States, but they're losing it. And who's the gainer? French. French are gaining it. That's all because of the machinations of Bancor, who came to power in 1926. So this is Poincaré's work. This tour de force of Colbertism, you could call it, which has its payoff in the accumulation of gold. And so the French are doing very well in that regard. Here we have the United States during this period, and we're coming up to the Depression in 1929. And here you see the enormous growth during the 20s of the US stock market, while the European countries are fighting over gold. Now, part of it is with their interest rates. Central banking theory is competitive in the 20s, and they raise their interest rates against each other, and gold comes into their economy. Now, sometimes they get only slight slight increases. These increases never got more than 6.5% prior to the crash of October 29. But the saying was current at the time that 6% is a whole lot, and that 10% will draw gold out of the moon. Now think of that idea. 10% will draw gold out of the moon. So 6.5% is quite a bit. They're competing with one another, and the stock market has to do with it. A lot of the money in the world that's spread out in all these endeavors that the British have given up to the United States, as we're told by Frieden in lovely detail. He gives us a really nice picture, a quick picture of the scene, knows a lot about Latin America, and says it all very briefly. There's a tendency for this hot money to look to the stock market in New York more than any other place. In fact, there's a good argument. I've never seen anybody argue this, but I would almost argue it. I think I should argue it. In fact, I think I have argued it, that one might think that the Depression was created by the stock market boom, and that the United States pulled all its money, for example, out of Germany in 1928, 29, 30, and ruined that whole circuit of payments that we were just describing, and set the Germans into depression right away in 1929, whereas it took 4 years in the United States, that the United States did that to put it in the stock market, and that the stock market is the cause of the Depression. At any rate, the cause of the world depression. Anyhow, you see the tremendous growth in the United States, and it has to do with U.S. automobiles. Would this have been the same if U.S. automobiles were competing with other automobiles? I don't know. Autos are at the center of this thing, and everything goes with them. Real estate in Florida. The car is important to getting to Florida, and all the other industries that have to, produce for the automobile: rubber, glass, every kind of electronic product, paints made by the DuPonts for automobiles, every kind of industry that gets summed up, so to speak, in the automobiles. You could talk a lot about commodities. Refrigerators, radios have to be taken into consideration, things like that. But the automobile is, I think, maybe the one thing that gives us a rapid, how to put it, a rapid insight into the thing. You're passing down a corridor and you glance into one of the open doors and you see something. That sort of aperçu, the French like to call that, where you get a glimpse of something, a sharp glimpse of something. You look at the automobiles. Okay, there's the industrial average, and look what happened with the crash. So it comes immediately, dramatically, steamingly down to the end of 1932. And so by 1932, they've erased all the growth from practically the World War I period. It's an enormous, gigantic crash in the United States. And world trade, of course, entirely collapsed. So here's the famous Kindleberger diagram. You recognize this from the video of Frieden that you're asked to look at. And this shows us the retraction of trade. It also allows us to take a look a little bit at this argument. During 1930, we have the Hawley-Smoot tariff. So some people have made the argument, I've seen the argument, but not really argued for, but just stated that tariff protectionism, especially the Hawley-Smoot tariff, 1930, that's what caused the Depression. Well, I think the experience we have, most of the economists who have kicked this around kind of reject that idea. I like the arguments of Peter Temin, Barry Eichengreen, Charles Kindleberger. These are the same people that Frieden depends on too. And that's one of the things I like about Frieden. He reads all the same people I do. And they don't seem to buy this argument stated as such. They think that it's the crash itself that brought down world trade. And this Kindleberger diagram would be compatible with that kind of an argument. There's something they put together to describe, I believe this is put together by Eichengreen too, to describe the crash in 2008. So the crash in 2008 is the red line heading down, and the the crash in 1929 is the blue line. You see it inscribes a kind of a similar path. In fact, the crash of 28, they were trying to argue, is more severe, as you can see in this graph, more severe. And that's the thing that causes the ships to get stalled in the harbors. You know, all the tankers were waiting outside of the ports in 2008. You know, the same way here, it stalls all trade. It hits it immediately. And maybe it's the best argument for describing why world trade went under. Maybe a little superior to the argument of high tariffs causing a depression. Of course, a free trader definitely would argue this way, grasping at anything that helps. But I don't know if we can buy that idea that the raising of the Hawley-Smoot tariff caused the depression. I don't know. You usually think of the raising of a tariff as stimulative in terms of the domestic industry. So it is not an intuitive, in my opinion, not an intuitive argument, but you will run across it at some length. The central banks were, in short, they did have a big role in the Depression. And in my other work on this, I follow those economic historians who lead us, not all of them lead us all the way, but who lead us to the thought that it was an interest rate war over hot money and over gold. Go back and look at that diagram of the French taking gold at the expense of the Anglo-Saxons for the backing to this argument. It's an interest rate war. And eventually it pulled money out of investors who had their money in the stock market and caused a crash. Okay. Sorry to have stated it so straightforwardly as all that with it. You know, it requires a long explication. This probably requires a book, as a matter of fact, but that I think is the way I see it. Interest rate war, struggle over gold. Montague Norman of the Bank of England used the phrase, a scramble for gold. That's a good phrase. That describes it, in my opinion. Scramble for gold. You can blame it on the French. You can blame it. It's not done much, but it could be done. You could argue. It's all Poincaré's fault, the Depression. Struggle among the international bankers, in other words. Herbert Hoover insisted that the Depression was created in Europe and imported to the United States. Roosevelt, coming into power in 1933 as his successor, said the opposite. He said it started in the United States. Now, as an economic argument, I guess I'm more with Hoover than as an interpretation of economic historians' work. I guess I'm more with Hoover than I'm with Roosevelt, but I think the sort of subtext of this argument is, for Hoover, the thing started in Europe, and so nothing could be done in the United States to fix it. That was, at any rate, his attitude. You have to wait it out. In fact, you have to deflate. Too much money in the economy. You have to deflate, make it all worse. Produce what has been called debt deflation. Make everything worse. Descending spiral of debt. But Roosevelt ended up with the opposite view on the matter. Now, we can't go into how this happens. All of this is fascinating stuff. I have way more that I would love to say about this, but for our purposes, we have to just state the bare outlines of this process. We're looking at this from the large perspective of the contours of globalism and globalization. And the main thing I think we have to consider here is Roosevelt's attitude toward the state, which is different from Hoover's. And Hoover's is much more the traditional old-time religion of central banking. In the Depression, you have to deflate. You cause bankruptcies and unemployment. Workers lower their wages. Wages have to bear the brunt of the whole thing, as Frieden points out constantly, Keynes pointed out constantly. Wages are called upon to bear the brunt. But Keynes started to say at some point, in his criticism of going back on gold in 1925, Keynes started to say, how far can we push this thing? You want to have a civil war with the miners? You want to drive the miners into poverty? Does everybody have to be totally miserable and totally poor? And can our society put up with it? uh, absolutely forcing the weakest people, the lowest uh, people on the economic ladder in your society to bear the brunt of all international uh, difficulties, all the adjustments. And that's what the theory calls for. So a lot of these people who we may think of as, well, I was brought up to think of Hoover was a terrible fellow and enemy. Well, in a way, all he was doing was following what was considered the orthodoxy. He had plenty of advice to go on this path. It was about all they could think of. You have to deflate. You have to make the economy even worse, sink farther into the depression. Between 1929 and 33, they go right down to the bottom. But Keynes already saying, no, use the state. The market will not make the adjustment fast enough, and it may never make the adjustment. And don't tell me it'll work out in the long run. In the long run, we're all dead, the famous phrase. In the long run, we're all dead. Let's do something right now, says Keynes. You got to use the state. And an essay he wrote in 1930 starts to put the outlines into this. It's largely with regard to the English situation. But it came to be associated with the improvisations of Franklin Roosevelt after the New Deal got started in 1933. You might say that Roosevelt is the real trailblazer rather than Keynes. Some have suggested something like that, and Keynes more or less codifies it with his theory of money, with his treatise on money in 1936. But it has to do with the first measures of the Roosevelt administration, which involved heavy state intervention and not reliance on the market. So in this cartoon, I can hardly read it. I've distorted it a bit, but it's a bank legislation and this very powerful inaugural address, which he enjoins the population not to submit to panic. He's thinking about the bank closures. And the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then a bank holiday to keep the banks from too many banks from failing, and then finally dealing with the gold standard, which Roosevelt wants to manipulate the price of gold in such a way as to raise the level, as to inflate, raise the level of prices and do it in terms of the value of gold. So he's constantly setting the price for the value of gold. And this is gold is coming into the United States because all the other European countries in depression are thinking of the United States as kind of a haven. And so they're getting more for their gold. They figure that they can get elsewhere. So at any rate, there are the arguments. Where am I? I'm going the wrong direction here. And also state intervention, how industry works with the National Recovery Act. Some people think this is an imitation of Italian corporatism. And some people in the Roosevelt administration said the same thing. Hugh Johnson said, we're imitating fascist Italy. Well, all he's saying really, even though he did have kind of a sort of a normal, I think, at the time, enthusiasm for fascist Italy, from Mussolini and all the rest of it. This is quite widespread in circles of notables in the 1930s. All he's saying is the state intervening in the economy, prescribing various practices for business. That's already been done in Italy, and maybe this is our version of it. Not that the United States is imitating Italian fascism, although that argument has been made. So the NRA might have made the U.S. into a kind of a corporatist state, you might say. That used to be argued. Corporatist state that really controlled a lot of how the corporations did business, but did it, as Roosevelt supposed, in a very genteel manner vis-a-vis labor, because together with this NRA is Clause 7A, which permits the unions to organize. They had a series of big strikes, and the unions began to come together on an industrial scale. That catches America up in terms of labor organization, catches America up with Britain. Industrial unions appeared in Britain in the 1890s. They appeared in the United States in the 1930s. So that starts with the NRA, and it starts with Roosevelt. So that's part of his attitude. Let the unions organize. give them a legal, and they're going to cement this in the Wagner Act in 1936 against the resistance of the Supreme Court. And that's the reason why the Supreme Court, why Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court, so to speak. And he eventually got his way when the Supreme Court relented. So he didn't have to pack the Supreme Court. And federal deposit insurance for your savings, which still exists. And this image that Roosevelt allowed himself to take on, this image of a guy who is really grasping the malefactors of great wealth by the throat, so to speak, and really talking turkey to them. Not exactly right, strictly speaking. He's more or less saving them, but he is saving them against their will. So there is, 2% truth to that. The biggest thing I think that Roosevelt did that we really need to pay attention to nowadays is to take a Hoover era institution, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was bailing out big businesses with government money in the Hoover era, so it already existed, take that thing over and to appoint a very energetic director, Jesse Jones, to take up a scheme of very far-reaching public works, something Joe Biden could definitely do, could definitely profit from. Or I should say the United States would profit if Joe Biden did that. The Green New Deal. This is the ticket for the Green New Deal. I don't know if they'll come up with anything like this, but this is where it goes. Anyhow, he took over this RFC, and together with a couple of other agencies, they were supported by the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve lent them money. In other words, these people were given an initial outlay, and then they were permitted to sell bonds to the Federal Reserve. So none of this affected the deficit. None of this affected taxes. The Federal Reserve was putting up, no, it was money creation, in other words. So public works by means of money creation. Cheap money, public works. Public works by means of money creation. That's the big innovation of the New Deal. And Jesse Jones handled the whole thing and built like mad. He wasn't even a New Dealer. He was a Republican from Texas. He turns out to be an enemy of Henry Wallace, one of the people who ganged up on Henry Wallace in 1944. Nevertheless, he's a guy who built America, at any rate from what it was in those days. There he is in a famous poster cartoon, in effect, signing orders for all kinds of big things all over the world. And these are all the places where he invested federal money in public works, roads and railroads, other schemes of transportation. Aquatic Park in San Francisco, maybe some of you who have gone there to go to the beach or to wade or to go out in a boat with its Art Deco kind of architecture. Aquatic Park, the Bay Bridge, Washington High School. And one of the other projects, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, to electrify the entire Tennessee Valley. Another huge public works project. Dam building all over the United States. Grand Coulee Dam, Hoover Dam. Job creation everywhere. By the way, none of this is inflationary, particularly because it's through job creation. It's not putting money in people's pockets, which is inflationary. But it doesn't do it. It does it indirectly, and the money flows down gradually and comes through growth. And the growth, in a certain sense, precedes the inflation. And we want inflation. Roosevelt wanted a certain degree of inflation. WPA projects where all sorts of other public services are done by people out of work who get jobs, provision for affordable housing, for public education, all sorts of things that are great for the workers, activities uh, uh, going on, employment on the rise, not great, but on the rise, and a certain green light. I mean, I say green, but somewhat green light for trade union organization. That is the model. And also aid to artists. So you get all sorts of wonderful things, the Federal Theater Project. And this, in my mind, this is the most important thing, or one of the most important things about the whole New Deal, was the assistance it gave to culture. It really did a lot for for the arts. Business took the view, well, not a lot of business, but some business was with Roosevelt all the way. All the ones associated with Rockefeller were told by Nomi Prinz's big book on the relation between the bankers and presidents. Very interesting volume. She tells us that a lot of business, and Frieden says the DuPonts and maybe the Morgan interests, as opposed to the Rockefellers who liked Roosevelt. This is an argument that they make. Anyway, in the press, there was a great deal of anti-Roosevelt stuff on the radio, quite a bit of anti-Roosevelt propaganda in the country about how he's ruining the country. But this cartoon makes fun of it by pointing out all the money that's being made during the New Deal. Of course, they're making money. Of course, growth is good. This was good for business. And Conrad Black's biography of Roosevelt recognizes this and is very, very useful for that reason. Um, and, let's consider before we quit a couple of canards about the New Deal, by Roosevelt haters and people who hate the New Deal and people who advocate the policies Milton Friedman has laid out, which are hostile to all the New Deal ideas. The idea the New Deal really didn't get us out of the Depression. I've heard that repeated by God knows how many people, Paul Krugman among them, of all people. It didn't get us out of the Depression. Look at this curve here, and you can see that the level of 1929, there's a level of 1929. When did we reach that? Right around here somewhere, about 1936, by the time Roosevelt ran for re-election. In one term. Well, this is Roosevelt's first term. So he's taken us out of the Depression. And then there's a Roosevelt recession in 37, which was caused by, I think, the attempt to bail out the British and the French in financial matters in 1936 through an international agreement, which we'll finish with today, but we're not quite there. And then an immediate spurt of new spending. And we still aren't near World War I yet, are we? World War II, I mean. No, 1940. We didn't come to the World War until 1941. So what's this generalization now? The New Deal didn't get us out of the Depression. It took World War II to get us out of the Depression. Nonsense. Or here's the same diagram roughly, another way of putting it, I suppose, and shows the same contours. The enormous slump by the Hoover deflationary policies, the enormous increase by the Roosevelt inflationary policies, cheap money in public works, the Roosevelt recession, there's the Roosevelt recession of 37, and there's the enormous spurt of growth up to Pearl Harbor. So all this is before World War II. And there's another way of putting the thing. In terms of personal income, you see exactly the same curve, plunging to 33, rising to 37, a caesura during the Roosevelt recession, and then the increase resumed on more or less the same pace, more or less. Was it all deflationary? I mean, inflationary. So that they wanted a certain amount of inflation and then not too much. There it is, a certain amount of inflation and not too much. So here we are in 1933, extreme deflation, and so prices do start to come up, but where do they go? About 5% or so. Okay, and do they get higher than 5%? No. So an inflation of about 5%. That won't kill anybody. That's good for growth. Certain amount of inflation. And Roosevelt absolutely aimed at this. Milton Friedman later on put it entirely in terms of the money supply. Said, oh, it's all a question of the money supply. He's only partially right, a percentage right. Their money supply was tinkered with. And so here you see a cut in the money supply during the Hoover days. And then there you see an increase in the money supply. Um, uh, the pump is primed, so to speak, by money creation through the Federal Reserve to back up these public works projects. And there you see the same tendency right up. And all this prior to World War II. Unemployment, the picture is not as good. So unemployment goes from a reasonable kind of 3 to 4% in 1929. That goes up to 1 out of every 4 workers in the course of the Hoover administration. So that's absolute catastrophe at that point. And Roosevelt brings it down, but it's still awfully high. And he never really got it below about 12%. So you still had high unemployment. Who knows how it would have worked if Roosevelt had had a little more time in peace. But of course, high unemployment absolutely disappears when the war comes. So you could make the argument that it required the war to get full employment. Okay, that's arguable. Gold reserves also probably should be taken into consideration. Here you have the gold stock. So here the United States is gaining gold throughout this interest rate war, which goes along here. It's gaining gold up to the time of the Depression. And then it takes in gold during the Depression. I guess that's the reason for all these deflationary policies, to get gold. It's a continuation of the scramble for gold, as Montague Norman of the Bank of England would have said. And the United States is going to have a colossal stock of gold throughout World War II. We only have to talk about the decline of that stock in our next discussion of the Cold War. Let's not do that just yet. And here we have to note that the gold price, pretty much the same after it's pegged by Roosevelt at $35 an ounce, and it's going to stay in that vein until 1968. And we'll talk about that when the gold price goes higher than $35 an ounce. So some people have made the argument. Christina Romer at Cal and in the Obama administration, she made the argument that it's this gold that underpinned all the experimentation in the United States, made it all possible. It's an argument. The argument that seems to be repeated most, I think, at any rate I repeat it, is Barry Eichengreen's in his famous book, Golden Fetters, in which he says more or less, although he never says it quite this way, but that's the message that emerges. The sooner you drop the gold standard and start devoting yourself to national economy and taking care of your own country, a la Keynes, the sooner you do that, the better off your national income picture is, the more things grow. There it is. And the country that does it the worst is France, because France never left the gold standard. So the French are holding up a gold block with a number of smaller countries in Europe and trying to live under the old-time religion, the old gold standard 19th century probity, and also criticizing the others for being profligate. That was their strategy. And they did that. They did not suffer the Depression. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why they were hated by people who were depressed, such as the British. Maybe it helps us understand something about appeasement, about winking at the Germans when they are doing things that are frightful to the French. At any rate, the French are pursuing this gold block, the old-time religion, and kind of stagnating under that system, but there it is. Oh, by the way, before we drop that, here's all the picture. This is about as many indices as you might want to use. From the standpoint of the anti-Roosevelt propaganda, here we have the unemployment rate, and it's better but not great, better but not ideal. And then here we have expenditures. They go way up. The state is spending a lot of money. And then here we have revenues. They lag behind. There's a deficit. And here's the deficit given to us. So the deficit, there is a deficit, but it's not much worse than the deficit that is inherited from the prior regime. It's not much worse. So maybe the same picture with regard to the deficit, same generalization might be made with regard to the deficit as might be made with regard to inflation. That there's an increase in both, but not dramatically so. All right, so those are the Roosevelt. That's the Roosevelt New Deal model, so to speak, in its barest economic outlines. As a democratic innovation, it needs to be appreciated with a completely different discussion, but we're concentrating on the economic history. And the Germans are doing something similar. Okay, Roosevelt is similar to Hitler? Nonsense. But Schacht is a little bit similar to Keynes. Both of them are critics of the old-time globalist economic religion of the bankers, the gold standard, free trade, X, Y, and Z in the 19th century. Schacht follows Friedrich List, if you remember him. He admires List more than he admires British political economy. He is the most faithful servitor of the British and French central banks during the 1920s. But no sooner did Hitler get power than he dropped Feder and he took up with Schacht. So Schacht is his man, and Schacht concocted every kind of state device to subsidize the arms industry. None of it made any economic sense according to the old globalist banking ideology. He broke all the rules. Schachtian deviltries, Fortune magazine called all of his devices, all designed to subsidize German rearmament. So rearmament is the heart of the matter. It is with Roosevelt too. Roosevelt had a big squawk with MacArthur over reductions in the army, but he was building the Navy up. Well, he didn't plan to land any troops all over the world, almost didn't in World War II. He wanted to build a Navy, wanted to build aircraft carriers, not battleships, aircraft carriers, the very latest stuff. And they were building them surreptitiously with money that was in other funds, seemed to be doing other kinds of public works. So part of the public works scheme was rearmament in the United States, and it's sort of clandestine. So that's why the United States appears right away after Pearl Harbor with a big Navy. That includes naval aviation too, not just carriers. You can imagine everything that goes into a carrier. So, if you were just looking at it in terms of economic history and you weren't looking at it in terms of anything else, and we don't want to do that, but if you were doing that, I guess you could say Schacht is kind of a Keynes in the German context. At any rate, he made it out that way at the end of the war when he was put on trial as being complicit with Hitler. Of course, he deserves every bit of it. All right, the French are mushing along with the gold standard. But then in 1936, they elected a government together with the communists, socialists and communists, led by a Jewish socialist, Leon Blum. And this was going to be a kind of French imitation of the New Deal, although the French were not going that way. But finally in 36, the workers elected this government, this radical combination on the left, this government of the socialists and communists. Mainly a socialist government supported by communists. You're going to see other versions of it. There was a Popular Front in Spain. That's what caused the Spanish Civil War. We can't go into that. Popular Front in China, basically. That's a whole interesting story all by itself. That's in my book, so you can read further on that if you're interested. In fact, I try to consider all the Popular Front experiments in terms of the same scheme of reference. Okay, but this Popular Front government sparked an enormous strike wave, just as it did in the United States when Roosevelt got elected. There were these big strikes, Toledo Auto Light strike, the Minneapolis Teamster strike led by Trotskyists, the San Francisco General strike led by the ILWU. It's the same thing in France. General strike, and then it was followed by the Matignon agreements, these government-sponsored agreements in which employers were forced to grant 15% wage increases. Wow, giant economic victory for the trade unions. You don't have anything comparable to this in the United States or any other country. But the employers hated this and immediately started getting out of the franc. So this actually helps the United States because a lot of gold starts coming in from France. It had already been doing so since about 1934 or so. A lot of gold starts coming into France, so it helps us at Fort Knox. But it more or less sinks the popular front and makes it look as if the French are going to totally drop out of the whole financial system. There was a panicked meeting of the finance ministers of Britain, France, and the United States while this was going on, while the gold bloc was collapsing. And the idea of it was to see if there couldn't be some central bank cooperation. Let's not take advantage of the French was the perspective. So it was a kind of an Anglo-Saxon, British and American convention to go easy on the French and not to punish them too much in view of their having fault, not to have in fact, to do away, if at all possible, with all the competition between the countries, the interest rate war that had caused the Depression, and to see if we can get some central bank cooperation. So this is the basis. I mean, you can already look at this agreement made in 1936, the Tripartite Economic Agreement, it's called. Britain, France, and the United States. Oh, and by the way, I haven't finished the sentence, but by the way, this is the reason for the Roosevelt Recession in the United States. The United States went home and instituted a deflationary policy so as to show its cooperation. Immediately it was a disaster, and they had to go back to the old Roosevelt inflation. So that helps explain our Roosevelt depression, so to speak, of 1937. But at any rate, this agreement at the end of 1936 is practically a foreshadowing of the post-war globalist order, at least the financial contours of it. I mean, we can sort of look at this agreement and we can sort of see the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the gold exchange standards, the Bretton Woods system of the post-war period. But in between, the thing over which we have to look is World War II. So does the World War II, does it confirm the wisdom of the New Deal? Or does it refute it? Let's take that up when we continue this. Next time we'll talk about the Bretton Woods Conference and the globalization scheme of the Cold War and matters relating to that.